Good evening. Welcome back to Whispered History. Tonight we are going to travel nearly 1,000 years into the past to a world of stone castles, desert roads, fortified cities, crowded marketplaces, armored knights, powerful sultans, and kings who believed that the fate of kingdoms could be decided on distant battlefields. This is the story of the Third Crusade, and at the center of it stand two extraordinary men. One was Richard the Lionheart, the warrior king of England, famous for his courage, ambition, and skill on the battlefield. The other was Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, a brilliant commander who had united much of the Muslim Near East and become the most powerful opponent of the Crusader states. They would become legendary rivals. Richard would cross thousands of miles to reclaim Jerusalem. Saladin would fight to keep it, and between them would unfold one of the most famous encounters of the medieval world. But tonight we are not going to rush toward the battles. Instead, we will move slowly back to the beginning. To understand why Richard and Saladin eventually faced one another, we must first understand the city that stood at the heart of everything, Jerusalem, a city sacred to Christians, Muslims, and Jews. For Christians in medieval Europe, Jerusalem was associated with the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. For Muslims, Jerusalem was one of the holiest cities in Islam, associated with the Prophet Muhammad and the sacred sanctuary known today as the Noble Sanctuary. For centuries, rulers and religious communities had struggled over the city's political control. By the 12th century, Jerusalem had become the center of a Christian kingdom established after the First Crusade. But the kingdom was surrounded by powerful Muslim states, and slowly a new leader was rising. His name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. The world would come to know him as Saladin. He had not been born as the ruler of a vast empire. His rise had taken years. Through military campaigns, diplomacy, alliances, and political calculation, Saladin gradually built his power. He became ruler of Egypt, then expanded his influence into Syria. He worked to bring rival Muslim territories together. His goal was not simply personal power. He wanted to strengthen Muslim resistance against the Crusader states, and by the 1180s, he had become a formidable force. Meanwhile, the Crusader states were facing their own problems. Political rivalries divided their leaders. Nobles competed for influence. Different rulers had different ambitions, and maintaining peace with neighboring Muslim powers was becoming increasingly difficult. The fragile balance eventually broke. In 1187, a Crusader army marched toward Saladin's forces. The two sides met near the Horns of Hattin in what is now northern Israel. The battle would become one of the most important turning points in the history of the Crusades. The Crusader army was exhausted. It had struggled to find sufficient water. Saladin's forces surrounded it, and on July 4th, 1187, the Crusader army was decisively defeated. Thousands were killed or captured. Among the prisoners was King Guy of Lusignan, ruler of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The defeat opened the road toward the Crusader cities. One after another, Saladin's forces captured important strongholds. And then, Jerusalem itself stood in danger. The city was defended by a relatively small force. Inside were civilians, soldiers, religious communities, and refugees who had fled from other places. Outside, Saladin's army approached. The atmosphere inside Jerusalem must have been filled with fear. People knew what had happened at Hattin. They knew that the Crusader army had been destroyed. They knew that Saladin had captured much of the surrounding territory, and they knew that there was little hope of defeating him in an open battle. The city prepared for a siege. Walls were strengthened. Defenders took their positions. people gathered whatever supplies they could find, and negotiations began. Saladin demanded the surrender of Jerusalem. The defenders initially refused, but the situation was becoming desperate. The walls could not hold forever. Eventually, negotiations produced an agreement. Jerusalem surrendered in October 1187. Unlike the bloody capture of Jerusalem by the First Crusade in 1099, the city's surrender under Saladin was negotiated. Many inhabitants were allowed to leave after paying ransoms, although not everyone was able to do so. For Christians across Europe, the news was devastating. Jerusalem, the holy city, had been lost. The shock traveled across kingdoms. Church bells rang. Preachers called for a new crusade. Kings began preparing armies, and among those who would eventually answer the call was one of the most famous kings of medieval Europe, Richard of England. He would later earn the nickname that history remembers so well, Richard the Lionheart. But Richard was not yet in the Holy Land. He was still a king dealing with his own ambitions, rivalries, and political struggles. And Saladin was already waiting on the other side of the Mediterranean world. Neither man could yet know how closely their names would eventually become connected. The fall of Jerusalem had created a crisis unlike anything Europe had seen for generations. Pope Gregory VIII called for a new crusade. European rulers began responding. The most powerful monarchs of Western Europe would eventually become involved. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa would take the overland route toward the east. King Philip II of France would prepare his own expedition, and Richard would become the most famous of them all. But reaching the Holy Land would not be simple. Armies had to travel enormous distances. Ships had to be prepared. Money had to be raised. Political agreements had to be made. Rival kings had to cooperate. And every ruler had his own ambitions. The Third Crusade would therefore be about much more than religion. It would involve kings competing with kings, generals competing with generals, diplomats negotiating behind the scenes, and two powerful men trying to shape the future of Jerusalem. Richard wanted the city back. Saladin intended to keep it. Between them stood thousands of soldiers, hundreds of miles of difficult terrain, and a history of conflict stretching back generations. But before Richard could meet Saladin, he first had to leave Europe. And before the armies could clash, they had to cross the sea. The stage was being prepared, ships were being built, knights were gathering, weapons were being forged, horses were being transported, and across the Mediterranean, Saladin was consolidating his position. The next chapter would begin with the journey east, a journey that would bring Richard the Lionheart toward the shores of the Holy Land, and eventually toward the man who had captured Jerusalem. Before we continue, if you enjoy these slow, immersive journeys through history, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to Whispered History. Your support helps the channel continue bringing you long-form historical stories designed to inform, relax, and accompany you through the night. So settle back, lower the lights, close your eyes if you wish, and let us continue our journey into the medieval world. The crusade had begun, and somewhere beyond the sea, Richard was coming. Saladin was waiting, and Jerusalem was at the center of it all. The story of Saladin begins long before he became the man who would capture Jerusalem. He was not born a sultan. He was not born into a throne. And he did not begin his life expecting to become one of the most famous military leaders of the medieval world. His name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. To his contemporaries, he was a Muslim ruler and military commander. To his enemies, he would become the great opponent of the Crusader states. And to later generations, he would become known simply as Saladin. His journey to power began in a world divided by rival kingdoms, competing Muslim rulers, and the Crusader states established in the eastern Mediterranean. The year was 1137 or 1138. Saladin was born in Tikrit, a fortified town on the Tigris River, into a Kurdish family. His father, Najm al-Din Ayyub, was a military and political figure. The family would eventually move westward, becoming connected with powerful rulers in Syria. Saladin grew up surrounded by politics and warfare. But according to many later accounts, he was not initially known as a particularly aggressive young warrior. He was educated, he studied religion, he learned about administration, and he became familiar with the political world of the Middle East. His early life was shaped by men who would eventually become extremely important to his future. One of them was his uncle Shirkuh. Shirkuh was an experienced military commander serving the powerful Syrian ruler Nur ad-Din. Nur ad-Din had inherited a divided political world. His ambition was to strengthen Muslim power in Syria and eventually challenge the Crusader states. Egypt became particularly important. At the time, Egypt was ruled by the Fatimid Caliphate. The Fatimid government was weakened by internal political struggles. Different factions competed for power, and this instability created an opportunity for outside rulers. Nur ad-Din wanted influence in Egypt. He sent military forces south. Shirkuh commanded them, and the young Saladin traveled with his uncle. This was the beginning of Saladin's rise. Imagine Egypt in the 1160s. The Nile flows through a fertile landscape. Cairo is crowded with merchants, soldiers, scholars, and officials. Palaces and mosques dominate the city. Markets fill the streets with noise. But beneath the activity, political uncertainty is everywhere. Different factions are competing for influence. Foreign armies are approaching. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem is watching events carefully. And every ruler understands that control of Egypt could change the balance of power in the entire region. Shirkuh entered this political struggle with military force. Saladin accompanied him. At first, the young man was not the central figure. His uncle was the commander. Saladin was learning, watching, listening, studying the decisions made by powerful men. He was learning how armies moved, how alliances were created, how rulers negotiated, and perhaps most importantly, how quickly political circumstances could change. The campaigns in Egypt were complicated. Crusader forces intervened. Fatimid officials sought outside assistance. Syrian forces entered the country. The struggle became a contest involving several powers at once. Eventually, Shirkuh succeeded. In 1169, he became the chief minister of the Fatimid government, but his position would not last long. Only a few months later, Shirkuh died. Suddenly, Saladin found himself in a position of extraordinary importance. He became vizier of Egypt. He was still relatively young, but now he was responsible for one of the richest and most strategically important regions in the Middle East. This was the beginning of his transformation. Saladin gradually strengthened his position. He reorganized administration. He built relationships with military leaders. He increased his influence, and he began moving Egypt away from Fatimid rule. In 1171, the Fatimid Caliphate came to an end. Saladin restored the Sunni religious tradition associated with the Abbasid Caliphate. Egypt was now firmly under his control. But Saladin's ambitions did not stop there. He understood that Egypt alone was not enough. If Muslim territories remained divided, the Crusader states could continue to survive. Jerusalem was protected by the political divisions surrounding it. If those divisions disappeared, the balance could change dramatically. Saladin therefore began building a larger political structure. He would eventually take control of much of Syria. But achieving that goal was not simple. Nur ad-Din, the man who had helped create Saladin's opportunity in Egypt, was still alive. And Saladin's growing power created tension. The student was becoming a rival. The relationship became increasingly complicated. Saladin had to be careful. Open conflict with Nur ad-Din could destroy everything he had built. So he waited. He strengthened his position. He negotiated. He watched. Then, in 1174, Nur ad-Din died. His death changed the political landscape. A power struggle followed. Saladin moved into Syria. He presented himself not simply as a conqueror, but as a defender of Muslim unity. His power expanded. Damascus came under his control. Other cities followed. There were still rivals. There were still rebellions. There were still Muslim rulers who did not want to submit to him. Saladin had to fight them, as well as the Crusaders. This is an important detail. Saladin's rise was not simply a straightforward war against Christianity. He spent years fighting Muslim rivals. He negotiated with some. He defeated others. He formed alliances. He used diplomacy when it was useful. And he used military force when diplomacy failed. His ultimate objective was to create enough unity to confront the Crusader states effectively. The process took years. By the 1180s, Saladin had become one of the most powerful rulers in the region. His territories stretched across Egypt and Syria. His armies were experienced. His treasury was stronger. His political influence was enormous, and now he could turn his attention toward the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. The Crusader states had existed for generations. They had castles, fortified cities, ports, military orders, and experienced warriors. They were not an easy enemy, but they were also divided. Their rulers disagreed. Their nobles competed for influence, and their ability to maintain peace with Saladin depended heavily on the actions of individual leaders. One of the most important figures on the Crusader side was Renaud of Chatillon. Renaud was notorious for his attacks against Muslim caravans. He had previously broken agreements with Saladin. He even launched attacks toward the Red Sea. These actions enraged Saladin. For him, Renaud was not simply another enemy. He represented the danger of a Crusader leadership that could not be trusted. A fragile peace existed between Saladin and the Kingdom of Jerusalem, but it was becoming increasingly fragile. Then came another major event. A caravan traveling through the region was attacked. The details became a source of intense dispute. Saladin demanded compensation. The Crusader leadership struggled to control the situation, and the possibility of war became increasingly likely. By 1187, the armies were moving. Saladin gathered a large force. The Crusaders assembled their own army. Both sides understood that the next confrontation could determine the future of the kingdom. The Crusader army eventually marched toward Saladin, but Saladin had chosen the battlefield carefully. The Crusaders were desperately trying to reach water. Their soldiers were exhausted. The heat was intense. The army was surrounded by hostile forces, and Saladin waited. On July 4th, 1187, the Battle of Hattin began. It would become one of the greatest victories of Saladin's career. The Crusader army was overwhelmed. The True Cross, a sacred relic carried by the Crusader forces, was captured. Many knights were killed. Thousands of soldiers were taken prisoner. King Guy of Jerusalem was captured, and among the captured nobles was Renaud of Chatillon. Saladin now had the Crusader kingdom at his mercy. The road toward Jerusalem was open for the first time in generations. The city itself was vulnerable. Saladin had spent years building his power. He had united territories, defeated rivals, strengthened armies, and prepared for this moment. Now, Jerusalem was waiting, and in the autumn of 1187, the armies of Saladin would gather outside its walls. The city that had stood at the center of the Crusader world was about to face its greatest crisis. And thousands of miles away, the news would soon reach Europe. Kings would hear that Jerusalem had fallen. Churches would mourn. Pope Gregory VIII would call for a new crusade. And one of the most famous kings in Europe would answer that call. Richard of England, the man history would remember as the Lionheart. But Richard had not yet begun his journey. First, Europe had to prepare. And Saladin was preparing for the storm that was coming from the west. The news of Jerusalem's fall traveled across Europe like a shockwave. In churches and royal courts, people heard that the holy city had been lost. For many Christians, this was more than the loss of a distant city. Jerusalem was sacred. It was the city associated with the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And now, it was under the control of Saladin. The defeat at Hattin had destroyed much of the military power of the kingdom of Jerusalem. King Guy was a prisoner. Many important nobles had been captured or killed, and Saladin's armies were moving from city to city. The situation seemed desperate. But across the Mediterranean, a response was beginning. The call for a new crusade had reached the most powerful rulers of Western Europe, and among them was a king whose reputation was already extraordinary. His name was Richard. Richard was born in 1157, the third son of King Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine. He was not born in England. Much of his early life was spent in the territories controlled by his powerful family in France. From an early age, Richard was surrounded by politics. His father ruled a vast collection of territories. His mother was one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe. Richard grew up speaking French and learning the traditions of aristocratic warfare. He was also exposed to the complicated rivalries of his own family. The royal household was not always peaceful. Richard's brothers competed for power. His father wanted to maintain control over his sons, and Eleanor herself had strong political ambitions. Richard became involved in rebellion against his father. This experience would shape him. He learned that political power could be as dangerous as warfare. A king could lose everything through a bad alliance. A noble could become an enemy overnight, and loyalty could change quickly. Richard was also deeply interested in military affairs. He became known as a capable commander. He fought in France. He defended his territories. He built a reputation for courage. By the time the news of Jerusalem reached him, Richard was already an experienced warrior. But he was not yet king. His father was still alive. Richard was ruling territories in France. Then the political situation changed. King Henry II died in 1189. Richard became King of England. He was 32 years old. But becoming king did not mean that Richard immediately settled into peaceful administration. He had another ambition, the crusade. Richard took the call to recover Jerusalem seriously. He began preparing an enormous expedition. This required money, a great deal of money. Armies needed weapons, horses, food, ships, supplies, and transportation. Richard raised funds throughout his territories. Taxes increased. Properties were sold. Officials gathered resources. The king was determined to build an expedition capable of confronting Saladin. But Richard was not the only European ruler preparing for the journey. King Philip II of France was also planning to join the crusade. The relationship between Richard and Philip was complicated. They were allies, but they were also rivals. Both were powerful kings. Both had ambitions, and both had reasons to distrust one another. For For the moment, however, they needed each other. Their armies would eventually travel together. The journey to the Holy Land would be long and dangerous. Another great ruler had already begun traveling toward the east, Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor. He was an elderly but enormously powerful monarch. Unlike Richard and Philip, Frederick chose the overland route. His army marched across Europe and into Byzantine territory. Thousands of soldiers followed him. The journey was difficult. Rivers had to be crossed. Mountains had to be navigated. Food and water had to be found. Relations with local rulers were sometimes tense. But Frederick's army continued. Then, tragedy struck. In 1190, Frederick drowned while crossing the Salif River in Cilicia. His death was a major blow to the crusade. Many of his soldiers abandoned the expedition. Others continued toward the Holy Land. But the great German army had been weakened. Richard and Philip were still preparing their own forces. They would travel by sea, and this would become a defining part of Richard's journey. Richard assembled a large fleet. The ships were loaded with soldiers, horses, weapons, food, and supplies. The Mediterranean Sea was now the road to the east. In 1191, Richard finally departed. His fleet traveled along the Mediterranean. The journey was not without problems. Storms could scatter ships. Ships could run aground. Supplies could be lost, and every stop along the way required political decisions. Richard eventually reached the island of Cyprus. This would become an important moment in the crusade. Cyprus was ruled by Isaac Komnenos, a local Byzantine ruler who had established himself as an independent authority. Richard's forces landed. Tensions quickly developed. Isaac resisted Richard. Richard responded with military force. The island was conquered. For Richard, Cyprus became strategically valuable. It offered a base in the eastern Mediterranean. It also provided supplies and wealth. But the conquest created another political complication. Richard was supposed to be fighting Saladin. Instead, he had just conquered a Christian island. This illustrates how complicated the Third Crusade really was. Religion was important, but politics was never far away. Richard needed money. He needed supplies. He needed strategic positions, and he wanted to demonstrate his authority. After securing Cyprus, Richard continued toward the Holy Land. The Crusader fleet sailed east. The destination was Acre. Acre was one of the most important ports in the region. The city was already under siege. Crusader forces had been trying to capture it for nearly 2 years. Saladin's army was nearby. The defenders inside Acre were holding out. The arrival of Richard's army could change everything. As Richard's ships approached, the coastline would have been filled with activity. Crusader camps stretched across the landscape. Siege engines stood outside the walls. Soldiers gathered around fires. Ships crowded the harbor. And inside Acre, the defenders prepared for another assault. Richard had finally arrived. The king, who had spent years preparing for the crusade, was now standing on the shores of the Holy Land. But Saladin was also nearby. He knew that Richard was no ordinary opponent. Richard had a reputation for courage and military skill. He had brought a large army, and he had arrived with determination. The Siege of Acre was about to enter its most intense phase. For nearly 2 years, the city had resisted. Now, Richard was ready to throw his full strength against its walls. The two great figures of the Third Crusade had not yet met face to face, but their armies were now close. Richard stood before Acre. Saladin watched from the surrounding countryside. Between them stood a heavily fortified city and thousands of soldiers. The coming struggle would test Richard's patience, military skill, and leadership. It would also show Saladin that the crusade had entered a new phase. The Lionheart had finally reached the Holy Land, and the real war was about to begin. The city of Acre had been under siege for nearly 2 years. By the summer of 1191, the struggle had become a brutal test of endurance. Inside the walls, Muslim defenders were holding out. Outside, Crusader armies surrounded the city, and beyond the Crusader lines, Saladin waited with his army. Now Richard the Lionheart had arrived. His presence changed the balance immediately. Richard had brought soldiers, ships, engineers, weapons, and siege equipment. He was determined to capture Acre. For him, the city was more than a military objective. It was the gateway to restoring Christian power along the coast. But the walls of Acre were formidable. The city stood on a narrow peninsula beside the Mediterranean. Its harbor gave it access to the sea. Its fortifications protected its inhabitants, and Saladin's army could provide support from outside. This meant the Crusaders faced an unusual problem. They had to attack the city while also defending themselves from the army surrounding them. Imagine the scene in the year 1191. Crusader tents stretch across the land outside Acre. Knights move between camps. Engineers construct enormous siege machines. Archers prepare their weapons. Ships wait offshore. Smoke rises from cooking fires. Inside the city, defenders watch from the walls. They can see the Crusader army gathering, and beyond them, they can see Saladin's forces. The city is caught between two worlds. Richard understands that time matters. Every day the siege continues. More soldiers become exhausted. Disease can spread. Supplies can disappear. And Saladin may find a way to break the siege. So Richard orders the construction and use of powerful siege engines. The Crusaders begin bombarding the walls. Huge stones crash against the fortifications. Wooden structures shake. Dust rises into the air. The defenders repair damaged sections. The process repeats: attack, repair, attack again. The siege becomes a war of patience. Richard himself becomes ill during the campaign. This is one of the lesser-known realities of his story. The famous Lionheart was not invincible. He suffered from illness during the siege, but even while sick, he remained involved in military planning. His determination impressed his followers. He wanted Acre taken. Nothing seemed likely to change his mind. Saladin, meanwhile, faced a difficult problem. He needed to protect the city, but he also had to preserve his own army. A direct attack against the entire Crusader force could be extremely dangerous. The Crusaders had built strong defensive positions. Their ships controlled important parts of the coast, and Richard had brought experienced soldiers. Saladin, therefore, relied on pressure, attacks against Crusader positions, harassment, attempts to disrupt supplies, efforts to communicate with the defenders inside Acre. The city was still connected to Saladin's army. Messages could pass. Supplies could sometimes reach the defenders. And as long as Acre held, the Crusaders could not easily move farther south. Richard understood that breaking this connection was essential. The Crusaders strengthened their siege lines. Their fleet tightened control of the harbor. The defenders became increasingly isolated. Inside Acre, conditions worsened. Food became scarce. Disease spread. People were exhausted. The city's walls had suffered repeated bombardment, yet the defenders continued resisting. They knew that surrender could mean captivity or death. They also believed that Saladin might eventually relieve the siege outside the walls. Saladin was searching for an opportunity. He launched attacks against the Crusader positions. Sometimes the fighting was intense, at other times both sides remained behind their defenses. The battlefield became a landscape of trenches, towers, siege engines, and temporary fortifications. Neither side could easily destroy the other. Then Richard's position strengthened further. More Crusaders arrived. The military orders were heavily involved. The Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, other European nobles, German, French, English, and other contingents. They did not always agree, but they shared a common objective. Acre. The city had become the center of the crusade, and the longer the siege lasted, the more important its capture became. Richard's relationship with Philip II of France was also deteriorating. The two kings had arrived as allies, but rivalry between them had never disappeared. Philip wanted influence. Richard wanted influence. Both had their own political interests, and the French king was increasingly frustrated by Richard's dominance. Eventually, Philip would leave the Holy Land. His departure weakened the Crusader coalition politically, but Richard remained. He had come to fight, and he intended to continue. By July 1191, the defenders of Acre were exhausted. The walls were badly damaged. Food supplies were running low. The possibility of surrender became increasingly serious. Saladin knew the city could not hold forever. He attempted to negotiate. The Crusaders demanded terms. The discussions continued. Finally, the defenders agreed to surrender. In July 1191, Acre fell to the Crusaders. For Richard, it was a major victory. After nearly 2 years of siege, the city was finally in Crusader hands. But victory did not bring peace. Instead, it created a new and terrible problem. Thousands of Muslim prisoners were now under Crusader control. Richard wanted Saladin to fulfill the terms of the surrender. He expected the return of prisoners. He wanted the payment of a large ransom. And he wanted the return of the true cross, the sacred relic captured at Hattin. Negotiations continued, but Saladin delayed. Perhaps he needed time. Perhaps he was trying to negotiate better terms. Perhaps the different groups involved could not agree. Whatever the reason, Richard became increasingly frustrated. His army was waiting. His prisoners were becoming a burden, and the crusade needed to move south. Richard wanted Jerusalem. Acre was only the beginning. But Saladin's delays created a dangerous situation. The prisoners were still under Crusader control. Richard feared that if he marched south without resolving the issue, they could become a security threat. The tension increased. Then, Richard made one of the most controversial decisions of the entire crusade. On August 20th, 1191, thousands of Muslim prisoners were executed outside Acre. The exact number remains debated by historians, but the event was enormous. The prisoners included soldiers and other captives. Richard's decision shocked the medieval world. For the Crusaders, it demonstrated that negotiations had failed, and that Saladin needed to understand the seriousness of Richard's demands. For Saladin and the Muslim world, it became another reason to continue resisting. The massacre remains one of the darkest moments of Richard's career. It also reminds us that the Third Crusade was not simply a romantic story of heroic knights. It was a brutal medieval war. People died. Cities were destroyed. Prisoners were executed. Families were separated. And religious ideals existed alongside political ambition and military necessity. Richard now had to move forward. Acre was secured. His army was ready. Saladin was waiting. The road south toward Jerusalem stretched before them. Richard knew that every mile would bring new danger. Saladin knew that the Crusaders could not simply march into Jerusalem. The desert would test them. The heat would weaken them. Their supplies would become vulnerable, and the Muslim army would constantly watch their movements. The two commanders were entering a new phase of the war. Richard had won Acre, but he had not won Jerusalem. Saladin had lost Acre, but his army remained intact. The decisive struggle was still ahead. The Crusader army began moving south along the coast. Richard rode at its head. His destination was Jerusalem, and somewhere beyond the horizon, Saladin was preparing his next move. The Lionheart had captured the first great prize. Now he would have to prove that he could defeat the man who had taken Jerusalem. The road south from Acre was waiting. Richard had achieved what the Crusaders had struggled to accomplish for nearly 2 years. Acre was theirs. But the capture of the city had not ended the war. It had only opened the next chapter. The ultimate prize remained Jerusalem. And between Acre and Jerusalem stood Saladin. After the fall of Acre in July 1191, Richard began preparing his army for the march south. The Crusaders would follow the Mediterranean coastline. This route offered an important advantage. The sea could provide supplies. Crusader ships could travel alongside the army, carrying food and equipment. But the road was still dangerous. Saladin's army controlled much of the surrounding countryside. His soldiers could attack the Crusader column whenever an opportunity appeared. Richard understood that protecting the army would be just as important as defeating the enemy. The Crusaders therefore moved carefully. The infantry formed a defensive formation. The cavalry protected the flanks. The military orders played an important role. The Templars, the Hospitallers, and other experienced warriors. Richard placed great importance on discipline. He knew that a large army could be destroyed if it became disorganized, and Saladin was waiting for exactly that opportunity. Imagine the coast in the year 1191. The Mediterranean stretches to the west. On the other side, the land rises gradually toward hills and mountains. Thousands of Crusaders move south. Banners wave above the marching columns. Knights ride beside infantry. Horses carry supplies. Ships move parallel to the army offshore. The journey is slow. Dust fills the air. The sun is intense. And somewhere beyond the hills, Saladin is watching. He knows that Richard's army is dangerous, but he also knows its weakness. It is large. It requires food. It needs water. It has to move in formation. And if the Crusaders become separated from their supplies, they could be vulnerable. Saladin therefore chooses not to immediately confront Richard in a massive battle. Instead, his forces harass the Crusaders. Mounted archers approach. They fire arrows, then retreat. Other troops attack from unexpected directions. The Crusaders respond with crossbows and cavalry, but Richard refuses to allow his army to break formation. He understands that chasing every small attack could be disastrous. The goal is not to win every skirmish. The goal is to reach the destination. This discipline would become one of Richard's greatest strengths. Saladin was trying to make the journey painful. Richard was trying to make it predictable, day after day. The Crusaders continued south. The army passed through difficult terrain. The heat became exhausting. Water had to be carefully managed. Soldiers became tired. Horses needed food. Yet the army continued. Richard's strategy was becoming clear. He wanted to remain close enough to the coast to receive supplies. He wanted to protect the army's flanks, and he wanted to avoid giving Saladin the opportunity to surround him. Saladin, meanwhile, was looking for a weakness. He knew that Richard could not simply march directly into Jerusalem. The city was inland. Its surrounding hills offered defensive advantages, and Saladin had time to prepare. He could strengthen the city's defenses. He could move troops. He could gather supplies, and most importantly, he could force Richard to fight on difficult ground. The Crusaders eventually reached the area around Arsuf. Here, the landscape offered Saladin an opportunity. The road passed between the sea and wooded terrain. The Crusader army would have to move through a relatively narrow corridor. Saladin decided to attack. The Battle of Arsuf would become one of the most famous battles of the Third Crusade, but Richard did not know exactly when the main attack would come. He only knew that Saladin was nearby, so he prepared his army. The Crusaders marched in a carefully organized formation. Infantry protected the supplies. Knights remained ready. The military orders guarded the rear. The Templars took one side. The Hospitallers took the other. Richard himself moved with the main force. Then, the attacks began. At first, Saladin's troops harassed the Crusader rear. Mounted archers approached. They fired arrows, then withdrew. More attacks followed. The pressure increased. The Crusaders were being attacked from multiple directions. But Richard ordered his soldiers to maintain discipline. The army continued marching. Imagine the scene. The year is 1191. The sun beats down on thousands of soldiers. Arrows fly through the air. Horses move nervously. Trumpets and shouting fill the battlefield. Crusader shields rise. The infantry hold their formation. The Muslim cavalry repeatedly approaches and withdraws. Saladin is testing the Crusader army. He wants them to become impatient. He wants the knights to break ranks. But Richard waits. He understands something important. A heavily armored knight can be devastating in a charge, but only if the charge happens at the right moment. If the cavalry attacks too early, the horses may become exhausted. The formation may collapse. The enemy can surround them, so Richard waits. The attacks continue. The Crusaders suffer casualties, but the army keeps moving. Eventually, the pressure becomes overwhelming. The Hospitallers at the rear are under particularly intense attack. Their position becomes increasingly dangerous. They send messages to Richard. They need permission to attack. Richard tells them to wait. Again, they wait. The pressure continues. Then finally, Richard gives the order. The Crusader knights charge. The effect is devastating. Heavy cavalry crashes into Saladin's forces. The armored knights move forward with enormous force. The Muslim troops are caught at close range. The carefully controlled Crusader formation suddenly becomes an attacking weapon. Saladin's army is forced to retreat. The Battle of Arsuf is a major Crusader victory. Richard has demonstrated that discipline can defeat harassment. He has shown that his army can withstand prolonged attacks without collapsing. And he has shown Saladin something else. The English king is not going to be easily manipulated. The victory increases Richard's reputation. His enemies now know that his army is dangerous in open battle, but Richard understands that Arsuf is not the end. Jerusalem is still far away, and the city remains heavily defended. The Crusaders continue south. They capture or secure important positions along the coast. Jaffa becomes increasingly important. The coastal route gives Richard a line of communication with his ships, but the closer he gets to Jerusalem, the more difficult the campaign becomes. The army has to move inland. The terrain becomes more challenging. The weather changes. Supplies become harder to transport, and Saladin's forces remain nearby. Richard now faces a difficult decision. Should he march directly toward Jerusalem, or should he strengthen the Crusader position along the coast first? Many of his soldiers want to continue. They have come all this way for one purpose, Jerusalem. But Richard understands that taking a city is not the same as holding it. Even if the Crusaders capture Jerusalem, how would they defend it? Their army is far from Europe. Their supply lines are vulnerable. Saladin still commands a powerful force, and the Crusaders cannot afford to lose everything in one desperate assault. Richard begins considering a different strategy. Rather than immediately attacking Jerusalem, he could strengthen the Crusader presence along the coast. If the coastline were secure, the Crusader states would have a stronger foundation. Jerusalem could then potentially be isolated. But every delay creates political pressure. The Crusaders are not united. Some leaders demand an immediate attack. Others fear that marching inland could destroy the army. And Richard himself has another concern. He is far from England. His kingdom has enemies. His brother John is ambitious. King Philip of France has already returned home. Richard knows that his position in Europe may be weakening. He cannot remain in the Holy Land forever. Saladin, meanwhile, is watching carefully. He is lost at Arsuf, but he has not lost the war. His army remains intact, Jerusalem remains under his control, and he has one enormous advantage: time. Richard needs a decisive result. Saladin can afford to wait. The two commanders are now engaged in a different kind of battle, not simply a battle of swords, but a battle of patience. Richard needs to decide how much risk he can accept. Saladin needs to prevent Richard from reaching Jerusalem with enough strength to capture it. The Crusader army moves slowly through the countryside. Ahead, the hills leading toward Jerusalem are visible for the first time in years. A Christian army is once again approaching the city. Richard has defeated Saladin at Arsuf. He has secured important positions along the coast. His army remains powerful, but now he must face the most difficult question of the entire crusade. Can he take Jerusalem? And even if he can he keep it? The answer will depend not only on military strength, it will depend on weather, supplies, morale, politics, and the decisions of two men who are beginning to understand each other without ever truly becoming friends: Richard the Lionheart and Saladin. Their greatest struggle is still ahead. Richard had won at Arsuf, but victory on the battlefield did not mean victory in the crusade. The road toward Jerusalem was still ahead, and as the Crusader army moved south, Richard faced a problem that no sword could easily solve. How do you capture a city when the enemy does not have to meet you in battle? Saladin had learned from Arsuf. He knew that Richard's army was extremely dangerous in a direct confrontation. The heavy cavalry could break through formations. The Crusaders were disciplined, and Richard had shown that he could keep his army together under tremendous pressure. So Saladin changed his approach. He would avoid giving Richard the kind of battle he wanted. Instead, he would make the journey itself the enemy. The Crusaders needed food, they needed water, they needed horses, they needed secure roads, and they needed a way to retreat if the attack on Jerusalem failed. Saladin could threaten all of these things. Imagine the year 1191. Richard's army is moving through the countryside. The soldiers are tired from months of campaigning. Their armor is heavy. Their horses are exhausted. The sun is intense. The road ahead leads toward the hills. Somewhere beyond those hills is Jerusalem, the city they have traveled thousands of miles to reach. But the closer they get, the more dangerous the journey becomes. Richard begins to understand that capturing Jerusalem will require more than courage. He needs information. Scouts report on the roads, engineers study the terrain, knights discuss possible routes. Military leaders argue over the best strategy. Some want to march immediately. Others want to secure the coastal territories first. Richard listens, but he does not rush. This is one of the most important differences between Richard the warrior of legend and Richard the commander of history. He was willing to wait when waiting offered a strategic advantage. The Crusader army eventually reached the area around Jaffa and moved toward the interior. For a moment, Jerusalem seemed almost within reach. The distant hills were visible. The dream of the crusade felt close. But then reality intervened. The land was difficult, the roads were challenging, water was limited, and Saladin's army remained nearby. Richard's commanders debated. If they marched directly to Jerusalem, they might be able to reach the city. But once they arrived, what then? Could they storm the walls? Could they maintain a siege? Could they bring enough supplies? Could they survive a prolonged confrontation? And if Jerusalem fell, could they defend it afterward? These questions mattered. A successful siege was only the first step. Holding Jerusalem against Saladin would be an entirely different problem. Richard knew this. He had not come all the way from Europe simply to win a dramatic battle. He needed a result that could survive after his army left. The Crusader leaders did not always agree. Some believed that taking Jerusalem was the only purpose of the expedition. Anything less would feel like failure. Others understood Richard's concerns. They knew that the army could be destroyed if it moved too far from the coast. The political divisions became increasingly important. The Crusade was an alliance of different groups: English knights, French nobles, German survivors, military orders, local Crusader nobles. Each group had its own interests. Richard could command his own followers, but he could not completely control everyone. And there was another problem. Richard had enemies back home. England was far away. His brother John was ambitious. Political rivals could use Richard's absence to strengthen their own positions. Every month Richard remained in the Holy Land increased the danger that his kingdom might become unstable. The crusade was therefore becoming a race against time. Richard needed to achieve something meaningful, but he could not remain indefinitely. Saladin understood this. He had a powerful advantage. He could afford to wait. His homeland was nearby. His political base was in the region. Richard had crossed an ocean. He had an entire kingdom thousands of miles away. The longer the crusade continued, the more difficult Richard's position became. Saladin began withdrawing from positions that could not be defended easily. Some towns were abandoned. Some fortifications were destroyed. The goal was to deny Richard useful bases. This was a harsh strategy, but it was effective. A Crusader army could capture a town, only to discover that the defenses had been damaged. They could occupy territory C, but maintaining it required troops. Every fortress needed guards. Every road needed protection. Every supply line needed soldiers. Saladin was making Richard spend resources simply to remain in place, and Richard had to decide where those resources mattered most. The city of Jerusalem remained the central question. Could it be taken? Richard's scouts studied the approaches. The army moved through the countryside. The hills became more prominent. The weather became cooler, and the Crusaders came closer. Then, Richard made a decision. The army would move toward Jerusalem. The moment was dramatic. After years of war, after Hattin, after Acre, after Arsuf, after thousands of miles of travel, the Crusaders were finally approaching the Holy City. Imagine the year 1192. A Crusader column moves slowly through the hills. Banners rise above the soldiers. Knights ride beneath them. Infantry march on foot. Priests pray. The sound of armor and horses fills the road. And ahead, Jerusalem. For many soldiers, the sight must have been overwhelming. They had crossed Europe and the Mediterranean. They had survived disease, sieges, battles, heat, hunger, and exhaustion. Now the city was close, but Richard still hesitated. The army's leaders wanted to continue. Richard knew the risks. The weather could become a problem. Supplies were limited. The surrounding countryside was difficult, and Saladin's army was waiting. The Crusaders were not yet close enough to guarantee success. So Richard ordered another pause. Some soldiers were frustrated. They had come to fight. They wanted Jerusalem. Why stop now? But Richard had to think beyond emotion. A failed attack could destroy the entire Crusader army. If that happened, Saladin could recover everything. A cautious decision might preserve the army. A reckless decision might end the crusade. Richard chose caution. The army withdrew toward the coast. For the soldiers who had dreamed of entering Jerusalem, this was devastating. They had been so close. They had seen the hills. They had imagined the city. And now they were turning away. Richard's decision remains one of the most debated aspects of the Third Crusade. Was he afraid to attack? Was he being realistic? Did he believe Jerusalem could not be defended? Or was he thinking about the political situation in Europe? The answer was probably a mixture of all of these things. Richard understood that winning a city was not enough. He needed to create a lasting strategic position. and that meant strengthening the Crusader coastline. Meanwhile, Saladin watched the Crusader withdrawal. He had prevented Richard from reaching Jerusalem, but he had also suffered enormous pressure. His forces had been defeated at Arsuf. The Crusaders had regained important territory, and Richard's army remained dangerous. Saladin could not simply assume victory. The war was still unresolved. Both leaders now understood something important. Neither side could easily destroy the other. Richard could win battles. Saladin could prevent the Crusaders from achieving their ultimate goal. The war had become a contest of endurance. And then, an unexpected opportunity appeared. The city of Jaffa. Jaffa was strategically important because it connected the Crusader army to the sea. If Saladin captured it, Richard's position could become extremely dangerous. Saladin therefore moved against the city. The Crusader garrison was small, the defenses were weak, and soon Jaffa was in serious danger. Richard received the news while away from the city. He understood immediately what it meant. If Jaffa fell, the Crusader position could collapse. There was no time for a long debate. Richard gathered his ships, he gathered his soldiers, and he moved rapidly toward Jaffa. The Lionheart was about to make one of the boldest decisions of the entire crusade. He would attempt to rescue the city by sea. The army that had struggled to reach Jerusalem was suddenly racing in the opposite direction. Saladin believed Jaffa was almost his. Richard intended to prove him wrong. The next battle would bring the two armies together again, but this time the fighting would take place around a coastal city, and Richard would have to defend Jaffa with a force far smaller than the one he had brought to Acre. The fate of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land would once again depend on the decisions of one man. Richard the Lionheart was coming back. The news from Jaffa arrived quickly. The city was in danger. Saladin's forces had moved against it, and the Crusader defenders were struggling to hold their position. For Richard, there was no time to hesitate. Jaffa was more than another coastal city. It was a vital link between the Crusader army and the Mediterranean. If Saladin captured it, Richard's position in the Holy Land could become extremely difficult. The roads were dangerous. The countryside was controlled by Saladin's forces, but the sea offered another route. Richard gathered his ships. He gathered the soldiers he could reach, and he sailed toward Jaffa. It was the summer of 1192. The Crusader king was once again moving toward danger, but this time he was not leading a huge army. He was rushing toward a city that might already be lost. As Richard's ships approached the coast, the situation became clearer. Saladin's forces had entered Jaffa. The city was largely under their control. The Crusader defenders had been overwhelmed. Only a small group remained in the citadel. They were surrounded. Their situation was desperate. Then, Richard arrived. The sight of the Crusader fleet approaching the harbor changed everything. Richard ordered his men to prepare for an immediate attack. There would be no long siege, no months of preparation, no time for elaborate plans. The city had to be recovered quickly. The Crusaders landed near the walls. Richard himself entered the fighting. His reputation for personal courage was not simply a story invented later. He frequently placed himself close to the action. His presence encouraged his soldiers. They saw their king fighting among them. The battle was intense. The Crusaders pushed into the city, street by street, building by building. They forced Saladin's troops backward. The Muslim forces had expected Jaffa to be secure. Now, the city was suddenly being contested again. Richard's soldiers fought with determination. The defenders inside the citadel were relieved, and gradually, the Crusaders regained control. Jaffa had been saved. But Saladin was not finished. He gathered his forces. He wanted to retake the city before Richard could strengthen its defenses. Soon, the two armies faced each other again. Richard had only a relatively small force. Saladin had many more soldiers. The odds appeared unfavorable, but Richard used the terrain carefully. The Crusaders formed a defensive line. Their shields were positioned close together. Their crossbowmen stood ready. The knights waited behind the infantry. Richard understood that Saladin's cavalry was strongest when it could surround and harass an opponent, so he denied them that opportunity. The Crusaders formed a compact defensive position near the shoreline. The sea protected one side. Their disciplined formation protected the other. Saladin's soldiers attacked. Mounted archers approached. Arrows filled the air. The Crusaders raised their shields. The horses became restless. But the formation held. Saladin's forces attacked again and again. Richard refused to allow his men to break ranks. The battle became a test of patience. Saladin's soldiers had the advantage in numbers. Richard had discipline. Imagine the scene in the year 1192. The Mediterranean shines beneath the sun. On the shore, hundreds of crusaders stand shoulder to shoulder. Their shields overlap. Crossbows are loaded. Knights wait behind them. Across the battlefield, Saladin's cavalry gathers. Dust rises beneath thousands of hooves. Trumpets sound, commands echo across the plain. Then the attack begins. Mounted troops charge toward the Crusader line. Arrows fly, the Crusaders hold. The attack slows. The cavalry pulls back. Then another wave approaches. Again, the Crusader formation remains intact. Richard watches carefully. He does not chase. He does not allow his soldiers to become scattered. He understands that the moment they lose discipline, the larger army will overwhelm them. The battle continues. Eventually, Richard sees an opportunity. He orders his knights forward. The Crusader cavalry launches a counterattack. The Muslim forces are pushed back. Saladin's attempt to retake Jaffa fails. The city remains in Crusader hands. For Richard, it is another remarkable victory. But there is something else happening. The repeated battles have demonstrated that neither side can easily defeat the other. Saladin cannot simply destroy Richard's army. Richard cannot simply march through Saladin's territories. The war is becoming exhausting. Both sides have suffered enormous losses. Both sides have spent vast amounts of money. And both sides are beginning to understand that complete victory may be impossible. This creates an unusual situation. Two enemies who have fought repeatedly begin to communicate. Richard and Saladin do not meet in person during the crusade, in the way later legends sometimes suggest. Instead, their representatives communicate. Messages travel between the two camps. Diplomats negotiate. Terms are discussed. Proposals are made. And slowly, the possibility of peace begins to emerge. Richard wants Jerusalem. Saladin wants to keep Jerusalem. Neither man is willing to surrender the central objective. But perhaps there is another solution. The Crusaders could keep the coastal territories they had recovered. Christian pilgrims could be allowed access to Jerusalem. The fighting could end. It would not be the victory Richard had hoped for, and it would not be the complete triumph Saladin wanted either, but it could bring stability. Still, Richard was not ready to give up the dream of Jerusalem. He considered another attempt. The Crusader army once again moved toward the interior. The hills were ahead. Jerusalem was not impossibly far away. The soldiers began to hope. Perhaps this time, Richard would finally attack. But the same problems remained. The roads were difficult. The weather was unpredictable. The supply situation was dangerous. And Saladin's army remained nearby. Richard's commanders continued debating the strategy. Some argued that they should attack immediately. Others warned that a failed assault could destroy everything. Richard listened, and once again, he hesitated. The decision was agonizing. The entire crusade had been built around Jerusalem. If Richard turned away again, what had they accomplished? They had captured Acre. They had defeated Saladin at Arsuf. They had recovered Jaffa. They had restored much of the Crusader coastline. But Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. For many Crusaders, that was not enough. Richard knew it. He also knew something else. If he died or was captured during a failed attack, the Crusader position could collapse completely. The king therefore chose caution. He did not launch the desperate assault his soldiers wanted. Instead, he began considering negotiations more seriously. The war had reached a point where both sides had reasons to stop. Saladin had prevented the Crusaders from taking Jerusalem. Richard had prevented Saladin from destroying the Crusader states along the coast. Neither side had achieved everything it wanted, but both had achieved enough to make peace possible. The negotiations became increasingly important. Messages traveled between the two leaders. Proposals were exchanged. There were discussions about territory, about pilgrimage, about Jerusalem, about the future of the Crusader states, and about the possibility of ending years of bloodshed. Richard's position was complicated by another concern. News from Europe was becoming more worrying. His kingdom needed him. His brother John was causing trouble. King Philip II of France had returned home and could become a political threat. Richard could not remain in the Holy Land indefinitely. Time was running out. Saladin understood this. The longer Richard stayed, the more pressure he faced. The crusade was approaching its final stage, but before the treaty could be completed, Richard and Saladin would have to negotiate the fate of Jerusalem. The city remained the great unanswered question. Richard could not simply abandon it. Saladin could not surrender it, and neither man wanted to risk another enormous battle. The solution would require compromise, a compromise that would disappoint many crusaders, but might finally bring peace. The Third Crusade had begun with the fall of Jerusalem. It had passed through Acre, Arsuf, Jaffa, and countless smaller battles. Now, it was approaching a different kind of battlefield, the negotiating table, and the final contest between Richard and Saladin would not be decided by swords alone. It would be decided by what each man was willing to accept and what each man was willing to leave behind. The fighting around Jaffa had shown both Richard and Saladin something important. Neither side could easily destroy the other. Richard could win battles. Saladin could prevent him from taking Jerusalem. The Crusaders could hold the coastline. Saladin could continue threatening their positions. And the longer the war continued, the more expensive it became for everyone. By the year 1192, the Third Crusade had reached a strange turning point. The two great commanders were still enemies, but they were beginning to understand that another great battle might accomplish less than a carefully negotiated agreement. Richard wanted Jerusalem. Saladin wanted to keep it. Neither man was prepared to surrender the city, yet both understood that their armies were exhausted. The war had already consumed enormous amounts of money, food, horses, and human lives. And Richard had another problem. His kingdom was thousands of miles away. England needed its king. Richard's absence had created opportunities for his enemies. His brother John was becoming increasingly ambitious. King Philip II of France had already returned to Europe. Richard could not remain in the Holy Land forever. Every day he stayed was another day when someone else could strengthen their position back home. Saladin also had reasons to seek an end to the fighting. His army had suffered. His territories had been damaged. The Crusaders still controlled important coastal cities, and although he had prevented Richard from taking Jerusalem, the war was far from cost-free. Neither ruler could claim complete victory. That reality opened the door to diplomacy. Messages began moving between the two sides. Richard communicated through representatives. Saladin did the same. The negotiations were complicated. There were questions about territory, questions about Jerusalem, questions about Christian pilgrims, questions about the future of the Crusader states. And behind all of these questions, there was distrust. Richard had spent years fighting Saladin. Saladin had spent years resisting Richard. Neither man could simply forget what had happened. The executions at Acre remained a dark memory. The battles at Arsuf and Jaffa had demonstrated the brutality of the conflict. Thousands had died. Neither side wanted to become vulnerable by trusting the other too quickly. Yet diplomacy continued. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Third Crusade is that Richard and Saladin became famous rivals without actually meeting face to face in the dramatic way later stories sometimes suggest. Their relationship was largely conducted through messengers. Their armies fought, their representatives negotiated, and each leader learned about the other through reports. Richard heard about Saladin's military movements. Saladin heard about Richard's decisions. They were separated by distance, but their names were constantly connected. The English king became famous for his battlefield courage. The Muslim sultan became famous for his strategic patience. Each represented a different kind of power. Richard often sought decisive military action. Saladin frequently preferred to avoid giving Richard the battle he wanted. Richard was aggressive when opportunities appeared. Saladin was willing to retreat when necessary. Neither approach was simply better. They were responses to different circumstances. Richard had traveled far from home. He needed results. Saladin was defending his own territories. He could afford to wait. That difference shaped everything. Imagine a quiet evening in the year 1192. A Crusader camp rests near the coast. The fires burn low. Soldiers are exhausted. Knights sit quietly beside their horses. A messenger arrives. He carries news from Saladin's representatives. The possibility of an agreement is being discussed. Some soldiers are hopeful, others are suspicious. For many Crusaders, the idea of peace without Jerusalem feels like failure. They had crossed Europe. They had survived the sea. They had fought at Acre. They had marched through the desert. They had fought at Arsuf. And yet, Jerusalem was still beyond their control. Richard understood their disappointment, but he also understood reality. An army cannot fight forever, and a king cannot remain away from his kingdom forever. The question was no longer simply, can Richard take Jerusalem? It was, what happens after he takes it? Suppose the Crusaders captured Jerusalem. Could they defend it? Saladin's army would still exist. The Crusader states would still be surrounded by Muslim territories. Richard would eventually have to return to Europe. Who would remain to defend the city? The Crusader leadership itself was divided. The military orders had their own interests. The nobles had their own ambitions, and Richard knew that without a strong political structure, a victory at Jerusalem could become temporary. This was perhaps the hardest lesson of the entire campaign. A battlefield victory can be immediate. Building a lasting political settlement is much harder. Saladin had learned the same lesson in reverse. He had captured Jerusalem, but keeping the entire region unified required constant effort. He had spent years negotiating and fighting against Muslim rivals. His empire was not held together simply by military strength. It required administration, alliances, money, and political skill. Now both men were approaching the same conclusion. Perhaps the crusade could not end with one side completely defeating the other. Perhaps the only practical solution was compromise. The negotiations continued. Richard demanded access to Jerusalem for Christian pilgrims. Saladin was willing to consider this. The Crusaders wanted to retain their territories along the coast. Saladin recognized that removing them completely would be difficult. The final settlement began taking shape. The city of Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims would be allowed to visit the holy sites. The Crusaders would retain a coastal corridor stretching through important cities. The war would end. It was not the victory Richard had promised his followers, but it was also not the victory Saladin might have wanted at the beginning. Both sides had to accept something. Richard could not take Jerusalem. Saladin could not destroy the Crusader presence. And so, the Third Crusade was moving toward peace, but peace was not welcomed by everyone. Some Crusaders believed Richard should continue fighting. They argued that Jerusalem was the purpose of the entire expedition. Without capturing the city, how could they call the crusade successful? Others understood that the army had already achieved significant gains. The Crusaders had recovered much of the coastline. They had secured important ports. They had defeated Saladin in major battles, and they had established access to Jerusalem for Christian pilgrims. The debate continued. Richard himself was torn. He had come to the Holy Land determined to recover Jerusalem. Leaving without it would be painful, but his political situation in Europe was becoming more urgent. News from England was increasingly troubling. His brother John was acting independently. Richard's enemies were becoming more active. If he remained away too long, he risked losing the kingdom he had inherited. A king could not fight two wars at once. Eventually, Richard accepted the reality that the crusade had reached its limit. A treaty was negotiated. In September 1192, the Treaty of Jaffa was concluded. The fighting would end. The Crusaders would retain the coastal territory they had recovered. Jerusalem would remain under Saladin's control. Christian pilgrims would be permitted to visit the holy places. The immediate fighting was over. Richard had not conquered Jerusalem. Saladin had not driven the Crusaders completely from the region. The result was therefore something between victory and defeat, a compromise, a fragile peace, and perhaps the only realistic outcome available. Richard now had to prepare for departure. The thought must have been difficult. He had spent years preparing for the crusade. He had crossed the Mediterranean. He had fought some of the most famous battles of his life. He had stood within sight of Jerusalem. And now he was leaving. The city remained in Saladin's hands. But the war was finished. Richard and Saladin would never become close friends. Their relationship remained that of enemies who had learned to respect one another's abilities. Yet their names would become permanently connected. Richard the Lionheart, Saladin, the Crusader king, the Muslim sultan, two men from completely different worlds, bound together by one extraordinary campaign. But before Richard could return home, he still had a dangerous journey ahead. The Mediterranean was waiting, Europe was waiting, and somewhere across the sea, his enemies were already watching. The Third Crusade was ending, but Richard's troubles were only beginning. The fighting was over. In the autumn of 1192, Richard the Lionheart prepared to leave the Holy Land. He had not captured Jerusalem, but he had achieved something that only a few years earlier had seemed almost impossible. The Crusader states had survived. A large section of the Mediterranean coastline had been recovered. Christian pilgrims had regained access to Jerusalem, and Saladin had been prevented from destroying the Crusader presence completely. Still, Richard knew that many people would see his departure as a disappointment. He had promised to fight for Jerusalem. He had come with enormous armies. He had defeated Saladin's forces in major battles, and yet the holy city remained under Muslim control. Richard himself was not satisfied, but he also knew that the war could not continue forever. His army was exhausted, his kingdom needed him, and the political situation in Europe was becoming increasingly dangerous. So Richard said goodbye to the Holy Land. Imagine the coastline in the year 1192. Ships are being prepared, horses are loaded, weapons are packed, soldiers gather on the shore. Some have spent years away from home. They are tired. Many have lost friends. Some have scars from battles. Others carry memories of sieges and long marches. The crusade had changed them. Richard looked toward the land behind him, the castles, the towns, the roads, and somewhere beyond them, Jerusalem. He had come close, but he had not entered its gates as conqueror. The ships finally departed. Richard was heading west. Saladin remained behind. For him, the outcome was also complicated. He had successfully kept Jerusalem. He had survived the arrival of Richard the Lionheart. He had prevented the Crusaders from achieving their greatest objective. But the war had been costly. His territories had suffered. His army had endured years of campaigning. The Crusaders still held important coastal territory, and the political unity he had worked so hard to create would eventually face new challenges. Yet, for the moment, there was peace. Richard sailed away, but his journey home would be unlike anything he expected. He could not safely travel through France. His enemies were watching. Richard had made powerful enemies during the Crusade. One of them was Leopold V, Duke of Austria. During the fighting at Acre, Leopold had taken part in the Crusader campaign, but relations between Leopold and Richard had deteriorated. Richard had offended him by removing his banner from part of the captured city. The insult was remembered. Years later, it would have consequences. Richard chose a dangerous route home. Instead of traveling openly through territories controlled by his enemies, he moved through Central Europe in disguise. He hoped to reach friendly territory, but traveling secretly was extremely difficult. He had spent years as one of the most famous kings in Europe. His face was known, his name was known, and eventually his identity was discovered. In December 1192, Richard was captured near Vienna. The King of England, a man who had commanded enormous armies, was suddenly a prisoner. His captor was Duke Leopold of Austria. Richard's enemies now had something they had never managed to take from him on the battlefield: his freedom. The news spread across Europe. Richard was alive, but he was imprisoned. His enemies demanded a ransom, and it was enormous. The English crown now faced a terrible problem. How could they raise enough money to free their king? Richard had been away for years. His kingdom had already been under pressure. Now enormous sums would be required. Taxes were raised. Property was collected. Church wealth was mobilized. People across England contributed. The ransom became a symbol of the enormous cost of the crusade. Meanwhile, Richard remained imprisoned. He was eventually transferred into the custody of the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI. This made his situation even more serious. He was no longer simply the prisoner of a regional duke. He was now being held by one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. Richard's freedom depended on negotiations and on money. For months, the king remained away from England. His brother John was taking advantage of the situation. John had political ambitions of his own. He hoped that Richard might never return. But Richard did return. In 1194, after the ransom was raised and agreements were made, Richard was released. He returned to England, but he would spend very little time there. The years after the Crusade became another chapter of warfare. Richard fought in France against King Philip II. The rivalry between the two kings continued. Richard's attention shifted away from the Holy Land. He had another battlefield to worry about. The irony was striking. Richard had crossed thousands of miles to fight Saladin, only to spend his remaining years fighting European rivals. The great Crusader king never returned to Jerusalem, and Saladin would never face him again. Back in the east, Saladin's life was also approaching its final chapter. The Sultan had survived the greatest military challenge of his career, but years of campaigning had taken a toll. His health was declining. The empire he had built required constant attention. He had spent decades fighting. Now, the great commander was becoming an older man. Saladin returned to Damascus. He continued governing. He continued managing political affairs. But the energy of his younger years was fading. In 1193, Saladin became seriously ill. His condition worsened. On March 4th, 1193, Saladin died in Damascus. He was approximately 55 years old. The man who had captured Jerusalem was gone. His death came only months after the end of the Third Crusade. The timing was remarkable. The two men whose names had become inseparable were now moving into history. Richard was still alive, Saladin was not, but both had already become legends. Saladin's death created a political problem. His empire had been held together largely through his personal authority. His sons and relatives inherited different territories. The unity he had created began to weaken. This did not mean his achievements disappeared. The Crusader states remained limited. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, and Saladin's reputation continued to grow. Richard, meanwhile, would spend the final years of his life fighting in France. He remained a celebrated warrior, but his reign was increasingly defined by warfare and political struggles. He would die in 1199 after being wounded during a siege in France. He was only 41. The two men had lived very different lives. Richard had been a king from birth. Saladin had risen through military and political skill. Richard was famous for aggressive battlefield leadership. Saladin became famous for patience, diplomacy, and strategic endurance. One was a Christian king from Western Europe. The other was a Muslim ruler from the Middle East. Their armies had fought each other repeatedly. Yet history remembered both men with a strange degree of admiration. Even some of their enemies respected their abilities. And over the centuries, their rivalry became larger than the war itself. Stories began transforming them into almost mythical figures. Richard became the perfect warrior king. Saladin became the noble sultan. But the real history was more complicated. Both men could be ruthless. Both made difficult political decisions. Both were capable of mercy. Both could be harsh. Both understood that warfare was not simply about courage. It was about resources, alliances, timing, information, and survival. The Third Crusade had ended without the dramatic victory that either side had originally imagined. Jerusalem remained in Saladin's hands, but Christian pilgrims could once again visit the city. The Crusaders held much of the coastline, and the Muslim world had successfully resisted the greatest Crusader army to arrive since the First Crusade. Neither Richard nor Saladin had achieved everything, but neither had been completely defeated, and perhaps that is why their story has endured. It was not a simple victory. It was a struggle between two powerful leaders who understood that sometimes survival itself is a form of victory. The crusade was over, But the story of Richard and Saladin was only beginning to enter legend, and the world would remember their names for centuries to come. The story of the Third Crusade did not end when Richard sailed away from the Holy Land. In many ways, that was only the beginning of the legend. Richard the Lionheart returned to Europe carrying the reputation of a warrior king. Saladin remained in the east, remembered as the ruler who had defended Jerusalem against one of the most powerful armies Europe could send. Neither man had achieved everything he wanted, but their names had become permanently connected. To understand why their rivalry became so famous, we have to step back from the battles and look at the men themselves. Richard was born into a powerful royal family. He inherited lands, armies, wealth, and political influence, but he also inherited enemies. His father, Henry II, had ruled an enormous collection of territories. Richard's family relationships were complicated. His brothers competed for power. His father struggled to control them. And Richard himself rebelled against Henry before eventually becoming king. This upbringing taught Richard something important. Power was never guaranteed. It had to be defended. A king could lose his throne through weakness. A noble could become an enemy through ambition. And political alliances could change in an instant. Richard therefore became a man who trusted military strength. He spent much of his life fighting. Even before the Third Crusade, he had developed a reputation as an aggressive and capable commander. But Richard was not simply a soldier. He was also a politician. He understood the value of money. He understood the importance of castles. He understood that a battlefield victory meant little if an enemy could simply rebuild afterward. His campaign against Saladin demonstrated this repeatedly. At Acre, he understood the importance of naval power. At Arsuf, he demonstrated extraordinary discipline. At Jaffa, he showed how quickly an army could respond to danger. But his greatest challenge was Jerusalem. Richard eventually realized that taking the city might be easier than keeping it. And that decision reveals something important about medieval warfare. A castle could be captured, a city could be conquered, but maintaining control required resources. Soldiers needed food, garrisons needed supplies, roads needed protection, and political alliances needed to survive. Richard could not remain in the Holy Land forever. His kingdom was far away. He had enemies in Europe, and his absence created opportunities for rivals. Saladin understood this. His own power depended on a different kind of strength. He had spent years uniting territories. He had fought Muslim rivals before confronting the Crusaders. He had learned to use diplomacy as carefully as military force. He knew when to attack, but he also knew when not to fight. That may have been one of his greatest strengths. At Arsuf, Saladin had attacked Richard repeatedly, but when Richard's army held formation and eventually counterattacked, Saladin withdrew. He did not sacrifice his entire army simply to prove his courage. He preserved his forces. This was not weakness, it was strategy. Saladin understood that the war was larger than one battle. If he lost an engagement but preserved his army, he could continue fighting. Richard understood the same principle. That is why neither commander could easily destroy the other. They were fighting different kinds of wars. Richard wanted a decisive result. Saladin wanted to prevent that result. The contrast created one of the most fascinating military rivalries of the medieval period. Richard was the Lionheart, a king famous for personal bravery. Saladin was the sultan who had rebuilt Muslim power around Jerusalem. Their personalities were also remembered differently. Richard became associated with courage and martial skill. Saladin became associated with discipline, generosity, and political intelligence. But historical reality was less romantic. Both men lived in a violent world. Both ordered military actions that resulted in deaths. Richard's decision to execute prisoners after the fall of Acre remains one of the darkest episodes of the Crusade. Saladin could also be ruthless toward enemies. The execution of prisoners after Hatton demonstrated that medieval warfare could be extremely brutal on both sides. Neither man fits neatly into the categories of hero and villain. They were products of their time. They were rulers trying to survive, and their decisions affected thousands of ordinary people. Soldiers were not the only ones caught in the conflict. Civilians lived behind city walls. Farmers worked fields between armies. Merchants depended on roads that could suddenly become battlefields. Families were separated. Cities changed hands. Castles were destroyed and rebuilt. The Third Crusade was therefore not simply a duel between two famous men. It was a conflict experienced by entire societies. And yet, Richard and Saladin became the faces of that enormous struggle. Their rivalry also created an unusual form of respect. Richard recognized that Saladin was a formidable opponent. Saladin recognized Richard's military ability. This did not make them friends. They remained enemies. But medieval warfare was not always driven by hatred alone. Rulers could respect the skill of opponents while continuing to fight them. Richard's representatives communicated with Saladin's representatives. Gifts and messages sometimes crossed the lines between the two sides. Stories later emerged about the two leaders exchanging gifts. Some of these stories were probably embellished over time, but the broader reality is clear. Diplomacy existed alongside warfare. The enemy was not always viewed as completely beyond negotiation. That became especially important as the crusade reached its final stage. Richard had to make a decision: continue fighting or accept a compromise. He chose compromise. The Treaty of Jaffa in 1192 ended the main fighting. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control. The Crusaders retained important coastal territories. Christian pilgrims were allowed access to the holy places. The arrangement was imperfect, but it created a temporary balance. Richard had failed to capture Jerusalem. Saladin had failed to remove the Crusaders completely. Both sides could claim something. Neither could claim everything. This is why the Third Crusade is sometimes misunderstood. People often expect a simple ending. One side wins, the other loses. But history rarely works that way. The crusade ended with exhaustion and compromise. The political map had changed. The Crusaders had recovered much of the coastline. Saladin had preserved Jerusalem, and the possibility of further conflict remained. Richard's departure did not mean that Christian ambitions in the Holy Land disappeared. Later, crusades would follow. European rulers would continue trying to recover Jerusalem. Muslim rulers would continue defending their territories. The struggle would continue for generations. But Richard's campaign had established something important. The Crusader states had survived. Saladin had demonstrated that Jerusalem could be defended, and the rivalry between the two men had become legendary. After Richard left, stories about him spread across Europe. He became the model of the warrior king. Poets celebrated his courage. Chroniclers described his battles. His nickname, the Lionheart, became inseparable from his identity. But his reign was not peaceful. Richard spent much of the remaining years of his life fighting in France. His greatest political enemy was Philip II. The French king had once joined him in the crusade. Now they were rivals. Richard built castles, raised armies, defended his territories, and continued fighting. The king who had crossed the Mediterranean to fight Saladin was now fighting another war closer to home. Then in 1199, Richard's life came to a sudden end. He was besieging the castle of Chalus in France. During the fighting, he was struck by a crossbow bolt. The wound became infected. Richard died on April 6, 1199. He was only 41 years old. His life had been short, but extraordinary. He had been a prince, a rebel, a king, a crusader, a prisoner, and a warrior. Saladin had died several years earlier, in 1193. He was around 55. His empire had been divided among his relatives, but his reputation survived. Richard's name survived too, and over the centuries, the two men became something more than historical figures. They became symbols. Richard represented the knightly warrior king. Saladin represented the powerful Muslim ruler defending Jerusalem. But perhaps the most interesting part of their legacy is that neither man fits perfectly into the legends created around them. Their real story was messier, more violent, more political, and far more human. They lived in a world where religion mattered deeply, but so did land, power, money, family, honor, and survival. The Third Crusade was shaped by all of these forces, and somewhere between the walls of Acre, the battlefield of Arsuf, the roads toward Jerusalem, and the shores of Jaffa, Richard and Saladin became rivals whose names would remain connected long after both men were gone. Their armies eventually disappeared. Their castles became ruins. Their political kingdoms changed. But the story remained, and perhaps that is why, even after more than 8 centuries, we are still fascinated by the Lionheart and the Sultan. 2 men, 2 worlds, 1 holy city, and 1 extraordinary chapter of medieval history. The story of Richard and Saladin had already become legendary, but the Third Crusade was more than the rivalry between 2 famous commanders. Behind every battle were thousands of ordinary people, soldiers who marched for months, sailors who crossed dangerous seas, farmers whose fields became battlefields, merchants whose trade routes were interrupted, families who watched armies pass through their towns, and religious pilgrims who believed that Jerusalem was worth the journey. By the time Richard left the Holy Land in 1192, the region had been transformed by years of war. The Crusaders had recovered important coastal territories. Saladin still controlled Jerusalem, and both sides were exhausted. The treaty had created a temporary peace, but peace did not erase the consequences of the war. In the Crusader territories, castles and towns needed rebuilding. Garrisons needed supplies. Trade routes had to be restored. And political leaders had to decide what would happen next. For Saladin, the years after the crusade were difficult. He had achieved his most important objective. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, but his empire was enormous, and maintaining unity across such a large territory required constant attention. Saladin had spent decades building his power. He had brought Egypt and Syria under his authority. He had fought Muslim rivals. He had fought the Crusaders. He had negotiated with rulers who did not always trust him. Now the pressure of ruling such a large realm was becoming increasingly heavy. Saladin returned to Damascus. The city was one of the most important centers of his power. Its markets were busy. Its mosques and schools attracted scholars. Its walls had witnessed generations of conflict. And within those walls, the great Sultan spent his final months. Unlike Richard, Saladin did not return to a distant kingdom. The lands he had fought for surrounded him, but victory had not brought him endless peace. His health was deteriorating. He was becoming increasingly weak. By early 1193, Saladin was seriously ill. His condition worsened. On March 4th, 1193, Saladin died in Damascus. He was around 55 years old. The ruler who had captured Jerusalem was gone. His death created uncertainty. Saladin had built a powerful political system around his own authority, but empires often become difficult to maintain after the death of their founder. His sons and relatives divided territories among themselves. The unity that Saladin had created began to weaken. This did not mean his achievements disappeared. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control. The Crusader states remained limited to their coastal territories, and Saladin's reputation continued to grow. Across the Muslim world, he was remembered as the ruler who had recovered Jerusalem. Across Europe, he was remembered as the formidable opponent of Richard the Lionheart. And over time, something unexpected happened. Saladin became admired even by some people who had once regarded him as an enemy. Medieval writers began telling stories about his character. Some stories described him as generous, others emphasized his courage. Some portrayed him as honorable toward defeated enemies. Not every story can be accepted literally. Medieval chroniclers often embellished events, but the fact that such stories became popular tells us something important. Saladin had become more than a political figure. He had become a symbol. Richard's story followed a similar path. After leaving the Holy Land, Richard was captured while traveling through Europe. His captivity became another dramatic chapter in his life. The King of England was held for ransom. His enemies demanded an enormous payment. England struggled to raise the money. Taxes were collected. Property was assessed. Church wealth was used. Ordinary people contributed. The cost of Richard's crusade was enormous. Yet eventually, Richard was released. He returned to his kingdom in 1194. But his time in England was brief. His political enemies were waiting. His brother John had become increasingly powerful. King Philip II of France was expanding his influence. Richard immediately returned to warfare. For the remainder of his life, he spent much of his time defending his French territories. He built castles, he raised armies, he fought battles, and he negotiated with nobles. The great Crusader king had returned to Europe, but the Holy Land remained in his memory. Richard never returned to Jerusalem. He never fought Saladin again. The two men had completed their great struggle, but their legacies were only beginning. Richard died in 1199. He was struck by a crossbow bolt during the Siege of Chalus in France. The wound became infected. He died on April 6th. He was only 41. His reign had lasted less than 10 years, but those years had included rebellion, kingship, the Third Crusade, captivity, and almost constant warfare. Richard's body was buried in different places according to the wishes of his family and medieval custom. His heart was buried at Rouen. His body was buried at Fontevraud Abbey. His legacy, however, was carried far beyond those places. He became one of the most famous kings of medieval Europe. But there was another side to Richard's reputation. The romantic image of the Lionheart often focuses on courage. It celebrates his skill in battle. It tells stories of his rivalry with Saladin. But Richard was also a ruler who could be ruthless. His decision to execute prisoners after the fall of Acre remains part of his historical record. He was not simply a noble knight from a medieval story. He was a king, and kings made difficult decisions that affected thousands of lives. Saladin was equally complicated. He could show generosity, he could negotiate, could demonstrate patience, but he also ordered harsh military actions. He executed prisoners after Hattin. He destroyed fortifications when necessary. He fought relentlessly to maintain his political position. Both men were shaped by the world they lived in, and that world was violent. The concept of chivalry existed. Honor mattered. Religious devotion mattered. But so did political survival. The Third Crusade cannot be understood without recognizing all of these forces. It was not simply Christians against Muslims. Christian rulers fought one another. Muslim rulers fought one another. Alliances shifted, political interests changed, and sometimes enemies negotiated. The Treaty of 1192 was a perfect example. Richard could not take Jerusalem. Saladin could not remove the Crusaders completely, so they created a compromise. The coastal Crusader territories survived. Jerusalem remained Muslim. Christian pilgrims received access to the city. It was not a perfect victory for either side, but perhaps that was precisely why it worked. For a time, the swords became quiet. Pilgrims could travel, merchants could move, people could rebuild. The peace would not last forever. The Crusades continued. New armies would eventually come from Europe. New rulers would rise in the Middle East. Jerusalem would remain at the center of religious and political struggles. But the Third Crusade had established a different kind of memory. It had shown that the Crusader states could survive without controlling Jerusalem. It had shown that Muslim powers could resist enormous European armies. And it had produced two figures whose names became permanently connected: Richard, Saladin, the Lionheart, the Sultan. Their rivalry would eventually become one of the most famous stories of the medieval world. But the real story was larger. It was the story of cities under siege, of armies crossing deserts, of ships crossing the Mediterranean, of people trying to survive between competing powers. It was the story of faith, but also ambition, of courage, but also fear, of victory, but also compromise. And perhaps most importantly, it was a story about how history rarely follows the path people expect. Richard set out to recover Jerusalem. He did not. Saladin fought to preserve Jerusalem. He succeeded, but neither man received everything he wanted. The crusade ended without a single dramatic winner. Instead, it ended with a fragile balance. And sometimes that is what history looks like. Not a perfect victory, not a complete defeat, but two exhausted sides realizing that they can no longer continue. Centuries later, people would still remember the battles. They would remember the castles. They would remember Acre, Arsuf, Jaffa, and Jerusalem. But perhaps they would remember the two men most of all, Richard the Lionheart and Saladin. Their armies have vanished. Their kingdoms have changed. Their castles have become ruins. Yet their names remain. And their story continues to whisper across the centuries. The Third Crusade was over, but the struggle for the Holy Land was not. The armies had gone home. The ships had sailed away. The banners of Richard's army had disappeared from the coast. And Saladin had returned to Damascus. Yet the lands between the Mediterranean and the interior were still filled with the remains of war. Broken walls, abandoned camps, burned fields, empty roads, and castles that had witnessed years of fighting. For the people who lived there, the crusade was not simply a story about kings. It was something they had experienced themselves. They had watched armies march past their homes. They had seen cities change hands. They had paid taxes to different rulers. They had fled from battles. And they had tried to rebuild their lives after the soldiers moved on. This is one of the easiest things to forget when we tell the story of Richard and Saladin. The famous commanders appear at the center, but surrounding them were thousands of ordinary people: farmers, merchants, craftsmen, sailors, pilgrims, women and children. Their lives were shaped by decisions made in distant royal courts. And when the fighting stopped, they were the ones who had to rebuild. The Treaty of Jaffa created a temporary period of stability. Christian pilgrims could travel to Jerusalem. The Crusaders retained important coastal territories. Saladin kept Jerusalem. It was an imperfect settlement, but compared with years of siege and warfare, even an imperfect peace could feel precious. Along the coast, merchants began moving again. Ships returned to ports. Markets became active. Farmers could work their fields without constantly fearing an approaching army. The sounds of trade slowly replaced the sounds of battle, but everyone understood that the peace might not last. Jerusalem remained a source of political and religious tension. For many Christians in Europe, leaving the city under Muslim rule was difficult to accept. The idea of another crusade never disappeared, and for Muslim rulers, the defense of Jerusalem remained an important symbol of political and religious legitimacy. The Third Crusade had ended, but the larger conflict had not. Saladin himself would not live long after the treaty. The years of campaigning had taken a heavy toll. His health declined. In 1193, he died in Damascus. His death created uncertainty within the territories he had united. Saladin's empire was divided among members of his family. His sons, brothers, and relatives received different territories. The unity that Saladin had created through years of political effort became more difficult to maintain, but his reputation survived. In the Muslim world, he was remembered as the ruler who had recovered Jerusalem and resisted the Crusaders. In Europe, he was remembered as the formidable enemy who had challenged Richard the Lionheart. And gradually, a fascinating transformation began. The enemy became a legend. Medieval writers began telling stories about Saladin's character. Some accounts described him as generous. Others emphasized his courage. Some portrayed him as remarkably respectful toward his enemies. Not every story can be accepted as literal fact. Medieval chroniclers often mixed history with storytelling, but the survival of these stories tells us something important. Saladin had become an extraordinary figure in the imagination of both sides. Richard experienced a similar transformation. After leaving the Holy Land, he was captured while traveling through Europe. His imprisonment became another dramatic chapter of his life. A king who had commanded thousands of soldiers was suddenly powerless. He was held for ransom. England was forced to raise an enormous amount of money for his release. The people of his kingdom paid taxes. Churches contributed wealth. Property was collected. Richard eventually returned to freedom, but his crusade had changed him, and his kingdom had changed while he was away. His brother John had grown more ambitious. Philip II of France had strengthened his position. Richard now had to fight to protect his lands in France. The Lionheart spent the final years of his life in European warfare. The Holy Land was far away. Saladin was gone. The crusade was history. But Richard's military career continued. Then, in 1199, his life came to an unexpected end. Richard was besieging the castle of Chalus in France. During the fighting, he was struck by a crossbow bolt. The wound became infected. Richard died on April 6, 1199. He was only 41. The famous warrior king was gone, but his reputation was only beginning to grow. Over the centuries, Richard became the perfect image of the medieval warrior king, the Lionheart, brave, aggressive, fearless, a king who personally entered battle. But the real Richard was more complicated. He spent enormous amounts of money on warfare. He was often absent from England. His decisions could be ruthless. and his crusade had cost thousands of lives. His greatest achievement was not the conquest of Jerusalem. It was the creation of a strong crusader position along the coast and the negotiation of a settlement that allowed Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem. That achievement was significant, but it was not the victory many people had imagined when the crusade began. And Saladin's victory was complicated too. He had kept Jerusalem, but the crusader states survived. The coastal territories remained in Christian hands. The Muslim world had not completely removed the crusader presence. Both sides had gained something. Both sides had lost something. And that balance would shape the region for years. The castles remained especially important. Fortifications along the coast became symbols of the continuing struggle. Acre remained a major crusader stronghold. Other castles and towns changed hands repeatedly in the decades that followed. The landscape itself became a record of the conflict. Stone walls carried scars from siege engines. Towers were rebuilt. Harbors were repaired. Roads were restored. New generations grew up among the remains of the old wars. For them, Richard and Saladin were already becoming figures from another age, and yet their names remained powerful. The Third Crusade would eventually be remembered as one of the greatest encounters between the Christian and Muslim worlds. But historians today understand that the reality was much more complicated. It was not simply Europe against the Middle East. Christian rulers competed with other Christian rulers. Muslim rulers competed with other Muslim rulers. Alliances changed. Trade continued even during periods of conflict. Diplomacy existed alongside warfare, and people on both sides were often motivated by politics as much as religion. The crusade was a religious war, but it was also a political struggle, a contest for territory, a struggle for trade routes, a fight for prestige, and a battle over who would control some of the most important cities in the Eastern Mediterranean. Richard and Saladin understood this world. They were deeply religious men by the standards of their time, but they were also rulers. They had kingdoms to protect, armies to maintain, allies to manage, and enemies to defeat. That is why their rivalry remains so fascinating. They were not simply two warriors standing on opposite sides of a battlefield. They were political leaders trying to survive an incredibly complicated world. And perhaps the most remarkable thing is this: after all the fighting, neither man destroyed the other. Richard could not take Jerusalem. Saladin could not destroy the Crusader states. Instead, they reached an uneasy compromise. And that compromise would last longer than either man's life. The Third Crusade had failed to achieve a complete victory for either side, but it had changed the balance of power. It had demonstrated the strength of Saladin's empire. It had demonstrated the military ability of Richard, and it had shown that even after years of brutal warfare, enemies could eventually sit down and negotiate. That lesson would become increasingly important as the centuries continued, because the Crusades were not finished. More armies would come. More rulers would dream of Jerusalem. More battles would be fought. But the shadow of Richard and Saladin would remain over all of them. The Lionheart and the Sultan had set a standard that later generations would struggle to escape. Their names had become inseparable. And as the 13th century approached, a new generation of rulers was preparing to inherit the unfinished struggle. The story of the Third Crusade was fading into memory, but the struggle for the Holy Land was only entering its next chapter. The story of the Third Crusade had ended, but its echoes were only beginning to spread across the centuries. Richard the Lionheart had returned toward Europe. Saladin had died in Damascus. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control. And along the Mediterranean coast, the Crusader states continued to exist. For a brief moment, the region was quieter, but peace in the medieval world was rarely permanent. The treaty between Richard and Saladin had created an uneasy balance. Christian pilgrims could visit Jerusalem. The Crusaders held important coastal territories. Saladin's successors controlled the Holy City and much of the surrounding region. Neither side had achieved everything it wanted, and that unfinished result would shape the future. In Europe, the memory of the Crusade remained powerful. Preachers continued speaking about Jerusalem. Nobles remembered the battles. Veterans returned home carrying stories of Acre, Arsuf, and Jaffa. Some returned wealthy, others returned wounded. Many never returned at all. For those who survived, the crusade became a memory that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Imagine an old crusader sitting beside a fire in Europe years after the war. His armor is no longer shining. His sword may be hanging above the fireplace. The excitement of the campaign has faded, but he remembers the sea. He remembers the heat. He remembers the walls of Acre. He remembers the sound of arrows striking shields. And perhaps he remembers the first time he saw Jerusalem. For a young knight, the crusade may once have seemed like an adventure. For an older man, it was something much more complicated. A memory of friends who never came home, a memory of fear, a memory of distant landscapes, and a reminder that history is written not only by kings, but by the people who survived their wars. In the East, the consequences were equally profound. The Crusader states had survived. Acre became their most important center. The coastline remained connected to European powers through ports and fortifications. Merchants continued trading. Ships continued crossing the Mediterranean. Christian pilgrims continued traveling toward the holy places. Muslim rulers continued governing Jerusalem. The city remained a center of religious life. And for the people living there, the world continued. This is important because the Crusades are sometimes imagined as one endless battlefield. But real life was rarely like that. Even during periods of war, people traded. Farmers planted crops. Craftsmen built houses. Merchants crossed political boundaries. Scholars studied. Religious communities continued their traditions. The Mediterranean was not simply a border between two civilizations. It was also a bridge. Ideas traveled across it. Goods traveled across it. Languages influenced one another. Technologies moved from one region to another. And people who were enemies on the battlefield could sometimes become trading partners in a marketplace. The world of Richard and Saladin was therefore far more connected than the simple stories of crusaders and Muslims might suggest. And yet, the memory of Jerusalem remained powerful. For Christians, the city was still a sacred destination. For Muslims, it remained one of the holiest places in Islam. For Jews, Jerusalem carried an even older sacred history. The city had survived centuries of conquest. Different rulers had controlled it. Different communities had lived there, and every new political struggle added another layer to its history. The Third Crusade had failed to change that fundamental reality. Jerusalem remained contested in memory, even when the fighting temporarily stopped. Richard's decision not to attack the city has been debated for centuries. Some have criticized him. They argue that he should have taken the opportunity when his army came close. Others believe that his caution was wise. A failed assault could have destroyed the Crusader army. Even if Jerusalem had fallen, defending it afterward might have been nearly impossible. Richard had to consider more than glory. He had to think about logistics, supplies, reinforcements, political unity, and the fact that his kingdom was thousands of miles away. The decision was not simple. It was one of those moments when history offers no perfect answer. Richard chose survival over spectacle, and perhaps that is why his decision remains controversial. The Lionheart had a reputation for courage, but courage did not mean recklessness. Sometimes, the most difficult decision a commander can make is to stop. Saladin faced similar choices throughout his career. He could not fight every enemy at once. He could not defend every fortress. He sometimes retreated. He sometimes negotiated. He sometimes waited. His greatest strength may have been his understanding that war was a long process. A single victory could be meaningless if it exhausted the army. A single defeat did not necessarily mean the war was lost. Both Richard and Saladin understood this. That was why the Third Crusade became a contest of endurance. The battles were dramatic, but the quieter decisions often mattered more. When to advance, when to retreat, when to negotiate, when to preserve supplies, when to protect a city, when to risk an army. These decisions shaped the outcome. And perhaps the greatest lesson of the Crusade is that military history is rarely about one heroic moment. It is about hundreds of choices, some made by kings, some by commanders, some by ordinary soldiers, some by people whose names were never recorded. The Crusade also changed Europe. Returning warriors brought stories from the East. Trade connections continued. European rulers learned more about the political world of the Mediterranean. The legend of the Holy Land became even stronger, and Richard's reputation grew. The Lionheart became almost larger than the man himself. Poets celebrated him. Chroniclers remembered him. Later generations imagined him as the perfect medieval warrior. But the historical Richard was more complicated. He was brave, he was ambitious, he was skilled, he was also expensive. His wars placed enormous financial pressure on his kingdom. He spent little of his reign peacefully in England, and his crusade had consumed vast resources. Yet his name endured because people remembered the image of the warrior king. Saladin's reputation grew in a similar way. He became more than a sultan. He became a symbol of Muslim resistance. Later generations remembered his defense of Jerusalem, his political achievements, his military campaigns, and stories of his generosity toward enemies. Again, the real man was more complicated than the legend, but legends are powerful. They survive because they give later generations a way to understand the past. Richard became the Lionheart. Saladin became the noble defender of Jerusalem, and their rivalry became a story that could be retold again and again. But perhaps the most remarkable part of their legacy is that they were remembered together. Their enemies did not erase one another. Instead, each made the other more famous. Without Saladin, Richard's greatest military story would not exist. Without Richard, Saladin's reputation as the defender of Jerusalem might have taken a different form. Their lives became connected by the struggle itself. Two men, two cultures, two political systems, two armies, one city, and one extraordinary campaign. But history did not stop with them. The Crusader states would face new threats, new rulers would rise in the Muslim world. European kings would once again turn their attention toward the Holy Land, and another crusade would eventually be called. The Fourth Crusade would take a very different path. Instead of reaching Jerusalem, its armies would turn against Constantinople. The history of the Crusades would become even more complicated, but the memory of the Third Crusade would remain. The battles at Acre and Arsuf would become famous. The diplomacy between Richard and Saladin would become legendary, and the Treaty of Jaffa would be remembered as an example of compromise after years of warfare. Perhaps that is where we should pause on the image of two exhausted civilizations standing at the end of a long war. Neither side has won everything. Neither side has lost everything. The swords have finally become quiet. The soldiers are returning home. The ships are leaving the coast. Jerusalem remains, and the people of the region begin rebuilding their lives. The Third Crusade had begun with the shocking fall of Jerusalem. It had brought together kings from across Europe. It had carried armies across the Mediterranean. It had produced famous battles. It had created legends, and it had ended without the conquest that many crusaders had dreamed of. But sometimes, the most important stories are not about who wins. They are about what remains afterward. And what remained was a changed Mediterranean world, a strengthened crusader coastline, a Muslim-controlled Jerusalem, and the enduring memory of two men whose names would forever be spoken together: Richard, the Lionheart, Saladin. Their war was over. Their lives were ending, but their legends were only beginning. The story of Richard and Saladin had entered the realm of legend. But before we leave the Third Crusade behind, it is worth looking once more at what the two men actually accomplished. Richard had failed to capture Jerusalem. Saladin had failed to remove the Crusaders completely, and yet both men had changed the political landscape of the Holy Land. Richard's army had arrived at a moment when the Crusader states were close to collapse. After the disaster at Hattin and the fall of Jerusalem, the future of the Christian presence in the region had seemed uncertain. But Richard's campaign changed that. Acre was recovered. The coastal cities were secured. Saladin's armies were defeated in important battles, and the Crusaders regained a strong position along the Mediterranean. Richard had not restored the kingdom of Jerusalem to its former strength, but he had prevented its complete destruction. Saladin, meanwhile, had achieved something equally significant. He had preserved Jerusalem. He had survived the arrival of some of the most powerful rulers in Europe, and he had demonstrated that the Muslim territories around the city could resist the Crusader armies. The result was not a simple victory. It was a balance, and that balance would shape the region for decades. By the time Richard departed in 1192, he knew that the crusade was finished. There would be no grand assault on Jerusalem, no triumphant entrance through the city gates, no final battle that would decide everything. Instead, there would be a treaty. The Treaty of Jaffa allowed the Crusaders to retain much of the coastline they had recovered. Jerusalem remained under Saladin's control. Christian pilgrims could travel to the Holy City, and the fighting would stop. For Richard, the agreement was a compromise. For Saladin, it was also a compromise. But compromise was sometimes the only form of victory available. Richard's soldiers could return home knowing they had survived. Saladin could remain in Jerusalem knowing that he had prevented its reconquest. The war had exhausted both sides, and perhaps both leaders understood that continuing the conflict could produce nothing except more graves. The treaty also revealed something important about medieval diplomacy. Even after years of violence, enemies could negotiate. Messages could cross the battlefield. Representatives could meet. Terms could be discussed, and eventually, a settlement could be reached. The medieval world was not divided into two completely isolated civilizations. Christian and Muslim rulers traded. They exchanged prisoners. They negotiated. They sometimes formed temporary alliances, and they learned from one another. The Crusades were violent conflicts, but they also created contact between distant societies. Goods traveled across the Mediterranean, technologies and military ideas spread, Languages influenced one another, and stories crossed cultural boundaries. Richard and Saladin themselves became part of that exchange. Their names were carried from one side of the Mediterranean to the other. The European world remembered Saladin. The Muslim world remembered Richard, and each became part of the other's history. But what happened after the treaty? Richard returned toward Europe, and his journey was far from peaceful. He was captured in Central Europe while attempting to travel secretly. The king, who had commanded enormous armies, suddenly found himself behind bars. His enemies demanded a huge ransom. England had to pay. The financial burden was enormous. People who had never seen the Holy Land were forced to contribute to the cost of freeing their king. Eventually, Richard returned to England in 1194, but he would spend most of his remaining years fighting in France. The Crusade had become a memory. His rivalry with Saladin was over, but Richard's appetite for warfare remained. He continued defending his territories against Philip II of France. He built fortifications, he raised armies, he planned campaigns, and he spent enormous amounts of time away from England. Then, in 1199, Richard was wounded during the Siege of Acre. A crossbow bolt struck him. The wound became infected. The Lionheart died on April 6, 1199. He was only 41, a king who had traveled thousands of miles, a commander who had fought at Acre, Arsuf, and Jaffa, was gone. But the legend had only begun. Saladin had already died several years earlier. In 1193, illness took his life in Damascus. He was around 55. His death created political difficulties for the empire he had built. His territories were divided among his relatives. The unity he had created did not remain intact forever, but Jerusalem stayed in Muslim hands, and Saladin's reputation continued to grow. Over the centuries, writers on both sides of the Mediterranean told stories about him. Some emphasized his generosity. Some praised his courage. Some described his treatment of prisoners. Others focused on his military achievements. As the centuries passed, the historical Saladin slowly became a symbol. Richard experienced the same transformation. The real men disappeared beneath the legends. Richard became the perfect warrior king. Saladin became the noble sultan. But neither description tells the entire truth. Richard could be courageous, but he could also be ruthless. Saladin could be generous, but he could also be severe. Both men lived in a violent age. Both ordered armies into battle. Both made decisions that caused suffering. And both were capable of diplomacy when warfare no longer served their interests. That complexity is what makes their story so fascinating. They were not fictional heroes. They were real human beings. They had families, ambitions, fears, weaknesses, and responsibilities. They had to make decisions without knowing what the future would bring. Richard did not know that leaving Jerusalem would become one of the most debated decisions of his career. Saladin did not know that his defense of Jerusalem would make him one of the most famous Muslim rulers in history. Neither knew that people centuries later would still compare them. Their world was disappearing, but their names would survive. And perhaps their greatest legacy is not simply that they fought one another, it is that they eventually understood something that warriors often discover too late. There are wars that cannot be won completely. There are enemies who cannot be destroyed. And sometimes, the strongest decision is to stop fighting. The Third Crusade had begun with a catastrophe. Jerusalem had fallen. The Christian world had been shocked. Kings had gathered armies. Ships had crossed the Mediterranean. Thousands had died. Cities had been besieged. Richard and Saladin had tested each other's strength. And in the end, Jerusalem remained where it had been. But the world around it had changed. The Crusaders had recovered much of the coast. Muslim control of Jerusalem had survived. Pilgrims could return, trade could resume, and for a time, the weapons were silent. The Third Crusade had not delivered the perfect victory that either side had imagined. Instead, it delivered something more complicated, a compromise, a pause, a fragile balance, and a story that would survive for centuries. Today, when people hear the name Richard the Lionheart, they often imagine a knight in shining armor. When they hear the name Saladin, they may imagine a noble sultan standing beneath the walls of Jerusalem. But behind those images were two men shaped by a difficult world. One traveled from the west to fight for a sacred city. The other fought to keep that city under his control. They met through armies, messengers, battles, and negotiations. They never needed a dramatic face-to-face confrontation to become legendary rivals. Their actions were enough. And perhaps that is why the story remains so powerful, because it is not simply a story about Christians and Muslims. It is a story about ambition, faith, power, fear, courage, loss, and compromise. It is the story of a king who could win battles but could not take Jerusalem, and a sultan who could keep Jerusalem but could not destroy his enemy. Two men, one city, one crusade, and a legacy that would outlive them both. As the sun sets over the ancient landscapes of the Holy Land, the castles remain, the old roads remain, the walls remain, and somewhere beneath the stones, the echoes of the Third Crusade still seem to linger. The armies are gone, the banners have faded, the swords have rusted, but the story remains, and soon we will reach the final chapter. The story of the Third Crusade began with the fall of Jerusalem. It ended not with the city changing hands, but with two exhausted sides accepting that neither could achieve everything it wanted. Richard the Lionheart had come to the Holy Land determined to recover Jerusalem. Saladin had spent years building his power so that Jerusalem could remain under Muslim control. Between them stood armies, castles, ships, deserts, mountains, and thousands of miles of history. And after years of fighting, neither man had been completely defeated. Richard had captured Acre. He had defeated Saladin's forces at Arsuf. He had recovered Jaffa. He had rebuilt much of the Crusader position along the coast. But Jerusalem remained beyond his reach. Saladin had preserved the holy city. He had survived the arrival of the most powerful Crusader army in generations, but he had been unable to drive the Crusaders completely from the region. The Treaty of Jaffa in 1192 created the final balance. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control. The Crusaders retained important coastal territories. Christian pilgrims were allowed to visit Jerusalem, and the fighting stopped. For a while, the Mediterranean became quieter. Ships continued to cross the sea. Merchants returned to the ports. Farmers returned to their fields. The walls of cities were repaired. Soldiers began returning home. And the people who had lived through the war tried to rebuild their lives. But the memory of the crusade would remain. For Richard, the Holy Land became one of the defining chapters of his life. He had crossed the sea as a king determined to win glory. He returned as a famous warrior, but without Jerusalem, his journey home would bring another unexpected chapter. Richard was captured while traveling through Europe. The king, who had commanded thousands of soldiers, was suddenly a prisoner. His enemies demanded a huge ransom. England struggled to pay it. Eventually, Richard was released, but he would never return to the Holy Land. His remaining years were spent fighting in Europe. Then, in 1199, his life ended at the Siege of Acre in France. A crossbow wound became fatal. Richard was only 41. The Lionheart was gone. Yet his reputation was just beginning to grow. Over the centuries, Richard became one of the most famous warrior kings of medieval Europe. Stories celebrated his courage, his battlefield skill, his determination. But the real Richard was more complicated than the legend. He could be brave, but he could also be ruthless. He could negotiate, but he could also choose violence. His decisions affected thousands of lives, and his crusade cost enormous amounts of money. Saladin's final chapter was equally complicated. He had achieved his central objective. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, but years of warfare had exhausted him. In 1193, Saladin died in Damascus. He was approximately 55 years old. His empire was divided among his relatives. The political unity he had created gradually weakened, but his reputation survived. In the Muslim world, he was remembered as the ruler who recovered Jerusalem. In Europe, he became the famous opponent of Richard the Lionheart. And something remarkable happened. Saladin became respected even by some of the people who had once regarded him as their enemy. Stories about his courage and generosity spread. Some were probably embellished, some became legends, but his reputation endured. Richard experienced the same transformation. The two men slowly became larger than the war itself. Richard became the Lionheart. Saladin became the great Sultan of Jerusalem. But perhaps the most important thing to remember is that neither man was simply a hero or a villain. They were human beings. They lived in a violent medieval world. Religion mattered deeply. But so did politics, power, land, trade, family, honor, and survival. The Third Crusade was shaped by all of these forces. That is why the story cannot be reduced to Christians versus Muslims. Christian rulers fought one another. Muslim rulers fought one another. Alliances changed. Enemies negotiated. Merchants continued trading. And ordinary people often found themselves caught between armies they had never chosen to fight. The crusade was a religious struggle, but it was also a political and military struggle, and Jerusalem was at its center. The city had survived conquest before. It would survive many more. Its walls would continue to witness the rise and fall of kingdoms. Its streets would continue to carry pilgrims from distant lands. Its sacred places would remain important to multiple faiths. And the story of Richard and Saladin would become one of the many layers of Jerusalem's enormous history. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the Third Crusade is that history rarely gives us perfect endings. Richard wanted Jerusalem. He did not get it. Saladin wanted to keep Jerusalem. He succeeded, but he could not destroy the Crusader states. Both men won something, both men lost something, and both eventually had to accept compromise. That is what makes the ending so human. After years of battles, after Acre, after Arsuf, after Jaffa, after the long roads toward Jerusalem, the final victory was not found on a battlefield. It was found in an agreement, a fragile agreement, but an agreement nonetheless. The weapons became quiet, and for a time, people could breathe. Imagine the Holy Land after the armies had departed. The evening sun falls across the hills. The roads are quiet. The Mediterranean stretches toward the horizon. A merchant prepares his goods for another journey. A farmer returns to his field. A pilgrim begins the long road toward Jerusalem. The castles remain on the hills. Some are damaged, some are being rebuilt, but they stand as reminders of the years that came before. The men who fought beneath those walls are gone. Their horses are gone. Their banners are gone. Their armies have disappeared into history, but the stones remain. And so do the stories. Richard the Lionheart, Saladin, two men who lived nearly 1,000 years ago, yet whose names are still recognized today. Their rivalry became legendary because it contained everything that makes history fascinating: war, faith, ambition, courage, strategy, loss, and diplomacy. Richard demonstrated how powerful a determined military commander could be. Saladin demonstrated how patience and political unity could resist enormous pressure. Neither man could completely defeat the other, and perhaps that is why their story has survived. Because the Third Crusade was not a simple tale of victory. It was a struggle between two powerful leaders who understood that sometimes survival matters more than glory, and sometimes peace is not the reward of the victorious, it is the decision of the exhausted. More than 8 centuries later, the landscapes of the Third Crusade still exist. Acre still has its harbor. Jaffa still looks toward the Mediterranean. The roads toward Jerusalem still wind through the hills. The old fortresses still rise above the landscape. And Jerusalem still stands. The same city that inspired kings to cross oceans. The same city that brought Richard and Saladin into conflict. The same city that neither man could completely possess. Perhaps that is the quietest lesson of all. Kings come and go, empires rise and fall, armies march across the earth, and eventually disappear. But cities remain, landscapes remain, memories remain, and stories remain. The Third Crusade began with a cry of shock after Jerusalem fell. It ended with a treaty instead of a conquest. Richard returned west. Saladin remained in the east. Both men eventually died, but neither truly disappeared. Their names continued traveling through history, from medieval chronicles, to books, to classrooms, to stories told centuries later, and now their story has reached us. The Lionheart and the Sultan, Richard and Saladin, two men who never needed to stand face to face to become legendary rivals. Their armies fought for Jerusalem. Their diplomats negotiated for peace, and history remembered them both. So tonight, as we leave the medieval world behind, imagine the ancient city beneath a darkening sky. The noise of battle has faded. The soldiers have gone. The banners have disappeared. Only the stone walls remain beneath the stars, and somewhere in the distance, the Mediterranean waves move gently against the shore. The crusade is over. The story is finished. But history never truly falls silent. It waits in old stones, in forgotten roads, in ruined castles, and in the stories passed from one generation to another. Thank you for joining me on Whispered History. If you enjoyed this journey through the Third Crusade, Richard the Lionheart, and Saladin, please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to Whispered History. Your support helps us continue exploring the forgotten battles, lost kingdoms, remarkable people, and quiet stories that shaped our world. Now, turn down the lights. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Close your eyes and imagine the distant sound of the Mediterranean, the wind moving through the ancient hills, and the footsteps of history slowly disappearing into the night. Good night, and until our next journey, let history whisper you to sleep.